Everybody, and welcome to our conversation in our Seeking Harmony series. Today is part 40, so we thought it was quite a cool milestone that this conversation has been taking place for just on 10 months. So thank you to everybody that's followed us and been supporting us throughout this time in our conversation, and to everybody that's liked and subscribed to our Church of Union YouTube channel, where you will find all our previous conversations. So today we are looking at a few topics that caught our attention and that we feel are quite relevant to discuss in the world today. And I think one of the things that the biggest thing, and it's probably the most topical one over various news agencies and in various countries at the moment, is the topic of climate change and the call across the world to really just start to look at much more sustainable energy sources that don't have such a dire impact on our environment and just in general the atmosphere of the world that we live in. So I'm going to open it up to the team and see what they feel is most relevant in that space at the moment, and we will continue our conversation in that way. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so the first thing that I saw about climate change with a gathering of world leaders in this past 2 weeks is Joe Biden's closing speech in COP27, really calling people for an urgent change, I would say, of the way we consume our planet's resources and the way we create energy, And I think he also said that he plays the US as a leader and as a role model to this change. And he also indicated that he has been on the road of creating more sustainable energy inside the US. And so I wonder, was that a political move, or is it really on a world to more sustainability? Because I think although maybe this might be changing, which I don't necessarily know, the US is still a big consumer of resources in the world. And yeah, I'm just curious to know what you think about that and what you know about that also.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely a feeling in the US of a good portion of the population of we choose to be and we want to be, we desire to be a leader in combating climate change, but there's also a good portion of the population that doesn't really feel that way and doesn't want to address climate change and make it a priority. So our country, I think, as a consciousness is kind of split on that and is really in a process of transformation and debate on it. And I think for President Biden, the only reason that he said that the US was a leader in that, which is it's just what Greta Thunberg would call greenwashing, painting your government green to make it look like your government's super green. But in reality, underneath that green paint is coal. So that's my metaphor for it being it's really fossil fuels underneath that. So yeah, I just feel he couldn't say, he felt he couldn't say that in the US we're really struggling with this, or we're making some steps, but not to the extent that we really want to and need to like combat this crisis, because I think he just felt like it would be too like unpopular with maybe his voting base, or it would be like he felt like it would be like, you know, a negative message or something. And yeah, that's basically what I think, that he basically felt it was better to say that America's a leader, because it, you know, like there's this feeling of like, if an American politician says, you know, to the world, like, oh, we're not doing so well on this, there's almost a feeling of like, we don't do that. We don't do that. But I think that we should say that, if we should be honest and truthful, you know. But I don't know why there's some degree of like, you know, masquerading, or what's the right word? Yeah. And maybe it's to like be more encouraging, I don't know, to the rest of the world, like being like, hey, like we got this, everybody join, you know. But yeah, what do you guys feel about it? I don't know.
Maybe it might be. I think that's why a lot of countries that are in development, or like are not like the wealthiest, or calling like the Western countries out about this, because they feel like they're not doing enough for climate change, and these countries are actually suffering from the consequences, which we talked about last week, in that climate debt, you know. And I don't know, I guess the speech was a strategy, could have gone both ways. I don't think, if he had said that we're not doing so well, I don't know what the effects would have been. I think he's trying to go to the best strategy that he thinks will like ignite change, maybe. But yeah, like, I don't know. Can we ignite change with just that? Sometimes a speech is enough, but like, I think maybe like going for a really positive speech for the US might not be the way to call more people for action. But yeah, we'll see. How do you guys, Isaiah and Granville, feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I just feel and know too that we're just not doing enough. Like, definitely not in the US, and just and the world collectively. You know, there needs to be drastic changes, and it's just not. We're not there. We're not doing that. And it was interesting in the article, because Biden said, you know, that we would be on track to reach our goals for 2023, but then we haven't met our goals for this last year. So it's like, okay, we really need to, what's happening here? We need to meet these goals, or at least do everything we can to get as close as we can to them. And I don't think that's the thing. Like, are we doing everything we can? I don't think so. And that's what we need to be doing. And I also believe we should just do what Greta Thunberg says we to do. She's just like, you know, the ultimate activist for climate change. And I do believe that she's right in what she speaks about. But yeah, that's how I feel about what's happening right now with the climate.
Well, my sense is a little bit of a joint thing. So yes, I agree that there was probably not necessarily completely owning up to the extent of the crisis. So I feel like there's probably some fanciful narrativing in that we can't really make it sound as bad as it really is on top of all of the other crises that we're facing. So kind of, like the global energy crisis, some of the food shortages at the moment are very top of mind for everybody. And so you've got a longer term crisis that requires planning, and a shorter term crisis that requires immediate action. So my sense is that too much of saying Rome is burning will just really debilitate people into not wanting to act as quickly as possible. So saying, yes, we're leading the charge, we'll get there, is planting the seed to not make it feel as bad as it is on top of all other crises. But at the same time, we also need to remember that right now, the more immediate, more desperate need, and specifically more in Europe, probably some parts of Africa, is that there is a gas and oil crisis right now, which is literally almost an immediate survival need, whereas a shift in climate change is not as detrimental to survival right now. So it's kind of, what do you focus your energy on or your attention on? What do you do in the short term? Because the short-term immediate crisis requires more immediate action. And yes, there's a lot of conversation around climate change with COP27 and also with the G20, but at the same time, there's also significant economic crises that are fueling the gas and oil crisis. So I just feel like from a humanity point of view, we're a little bit crisised out, and we kind of need to just remember that you can't constantly tell people something is wrong without actually giving them very practical, real steps in order to shift in the direction of improvement. So yeah, I think it's very much right now a balancing act, and that's requiring attention on the shorter term rather than the longer term. And I think that's what we're seeing playing out.
Yeah, and I think that Biden wanted to point out a victory, like a smaller victory, that I think what I read was the US is on track to meet its goals with like its goals for reducing specifically methane emissions by 2030, which is good because like methane, it's a really potent greenhouse gas, and so yeah, it like contributes a lot to climate change and everything. So that's good that the US is on track, with methane at least, but I don't think it is on track for the goals, that were determined for like other things like CO2 emissions especially. But I feel that psychologically, and maybe from a standpoint of like, yeah, like acknowledging what you were saying, Granville, it was a good thing to at least for him to spotlight like one victory, like one thing that is like going well, because it shows that progress is possible. And I think, yeah, that is important for people, because even though climate change is a crisis that is more like slow moving, to some people, they do feel stressed out about it or they feel upset about it, like regardless, on top of, like you said, everything else. So yeah, I think it's worth highlighting, you know, that like smaller victory. Yeah.
I think maybe it brought balance to everything, like having actors that were pinpointing like really everything, really being honest and truthful. It may not be about a side, and it's not like all black and white. It's just like, okay, here's where we are lacking, and here's where we are improving. Although what I feel is that we're yet to find a solution. I'm thinking a lot about like unionism there, you know, and I think we've yet to find a solution with a vision that would serve both the short-term and the long-term visions for our planet. And I think that's our lesson to learn as a consciousness and our way to ascension in that way, because we are also, I guess, ascending in terms of like environment. And I think we've seen how like useless it's been in the last like COP meetings to have this kind of like anxiety driven talks about like nothing is done and we're signing treaties but no one is respecting them. And actually, like, maybe it's time to stop pointing fingers and start, like, I guess, owning up to our like global karma about this, because we all participate in this in some way, you know. And yeah, it just reminds me of unionism in the sense that when you like are driven by change and like can call all of your like, I guess, teammates, your community to get driven by change and make a common choice, like everyone ascends, you know. And so I think it's really like something that we should keep in mind. And maybe that we're seeing, because I've seen less like finger pointing than the last few years. And maybe people are just realizing that, all right, it's not about finger pointing anymore. And maybe it's not about having, making a choice between short term and long term, and realizing that we don't have to sacrifice anything for our greater good, but that we must find a choice of love that serves all of it, and that is basically internal in there. And yeah, as soon as I think a lot of people will make that choice, I feel we will like progress a whole lot, I guess.
Yeah, so I agree with you in the sense that there's obviously there's a very obvious need for us to not kind of play in the space of trade-offs at the moment, but rather to play in the space of choosing sustainability across long-term, short-term, macro, micro kind of parameters. And so there is definitely the requirement to make decisions and choices that at the core of it serve the greater good, and serve the greater good of humanity, serve the greater good of the individual, serve the greater good of the planet. So I agree with you that there's definitely a shift in what's required from the level of choice and the extent of that choice, and the feeling that there needs to be some type or level of sacrifice in those choices is probably, for me, the bigger piece of healing that needs to happen. That you don't need to trade off your longer term good against your shorter term good, or vice versa. Kind of choosing your good and living in that way and accepting, but also constantly reinforcing that choice and constantly reinforcing the choice to have much more sustainability, more stability. And I think it really does come through in lots of the topics all the time. It's this collective call in consciousness for greater levels of stability across various aspects, or even just areas of life. It's just like much more stability, safety, security, sensibility. So I think I agree with you that there's definitely a call for new choices, but new longer term sustainable choices that cover life in a much more blanketed way than what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, that was good. I think. I'm thinking of maybe talking about like the crisis with elephants in East Africa, like the topic that Sage brought up this week. Because I think it has that energy of maybe like trying to have choices and making sacrifices, you know. So I would love for Sage to maybe explain it a little bit more. And then maybe we can talk about that.
Yeah. It's super, it's like in the same type of thing, an interesting like thing about like how people are viewing a problem and the solutions to it and everything. So basically like in Southern Sudan and Southern Africa in general, there's been like this big increase in the population of elephants, which, you know, in general, like from a conservation point of view, is awesome because, you know, the elephants haven't always been in such great numbers. But for example, like there's, for example, in Zimbabwe, there's like a huge national park where the population of elephants is like triple the capacity, like more than triple the capacity of the national park. It's like they're supposed to be, well, the area of the park can sustain like 15,000 elephants, and the population in that area is 55,000. So yeah, those elephants have really just been like expanding. So good for them. But the problem is they're wandering off the park grounds and they're like, you know, eating massive quantities of like trees, bark and leaves, and disrupting the environment for like farmers, you know, and drinking a bunch of the water that the farmers use and stuff like that. And also, you know, sometimes the farmers like encounter the elephants and the elephants injure them or, you know, even kill them. And so it's gotten intense there. And so, you know, one of the solutions being proposed by some of those countries, like Botswana and Zimbabwe, has been to like permit the sale of ivory again, because like ivory isn't permitted to be sold. And with that, you know, elephants, people could hunt elephants and they could like make money off of selling the tusks. And it's so, you know, instead of having to rely on subsistence farming when their farms have been like disrupted by these huge elephant populations, they can just rely on the sale of ivory, and they can buy food instead of doing subsistence farming. And so that is one proposed solution. And then there's like this international conference going on right now in Panama about like endangered species and about conservation. So representatives from like some Southern African countries are saying, hey, let's legalize the ivory trade. And then some East African countries like Kenya was mentioned in the article I read were saying, no, because like any time that we've legalized ivory trade, poaching has gone up anytime. And in East Africa, that's a big concern because they don't have the same boom in the population of elephants. So they're like, no, we don't want to do that. Why don't you guys focus on more ecotourism, like have people, come out and see these elephants, and make money through that industry, perhaps find some other solution. So it's a really interesting, like, debate that's going on right now. Yeah. What do you guys feel about it? Is it like, it's kind of like there's a solution where nobody loses and there's a solution that is like a sacrifice, or yeah.
I would say my sense is that, as the East African countries said, every time we've like legalized this market, I think like there's a tendency to abuse it. And so my sense is that you cannot like just like half love your environment. And I think like selling like ivory is kind of like half loving your environment. It's like the gateway to just not love at all, because you can't make like a half choice, in my opinion. And yeah, I think the farmers are having a lot of problems, but I also know that elephants have a great memory and a great sensorial intelligence, and that also while ivory trade was allowed, maybe the farmers were evolving and growing on, natural soil that the elephants used to have. And so maybe there's a rebalancing there to have. I don't know a lot about like how it is really in like the southern countries of Africa, but I do feel like there's some kind of like rebalancing to have there, because you can't go back on this decisions, and you can't like spend your life like choosing to like fight nature or trying to regulate nature, because I don't think that's something you can actually regulate, But I'm curious to know like if Grenville maybe has some opinion about this or knows more about it, or even Isaiah, like what do you guys feel?
Yeah, so for me, I think if I recall from just a historical point of view, there was significant issues around poaching and those kind of things. Probably mid to late 90s, early 2000s. There was a significant issue around poaching and just the illegal trade in ivory. But I also believe that there was a lot of sort of environmental decision making as well, in terms of culling the number of certain species at certain points. And I recall at some point that there was the sense that certain species were endangered. And so the shift is nice to see, but I do believe that there is a requirement to balance what happens naturally with what is actually sustainable. And if a national park cannot sustain the elephant population, I would say that either you relocate some of those elephants or you are going to need to cull to reduce the numbers, because unfortunately, I think it's proven over and over again that's just natural resources are finite. And so there needs to be a point at which you allow those natural resources to naturally replenish themselves. And so if the elephant population in a certain space is too big for it to be sustainable, there are some difficult decisions that need to happen that makes it sustainable for the majority. So I think probably some level of scientific study is required to ensure that the right type of decision is being made, but also to ensure that we don't make, again, short-term decisions that will have long-term consequences. So we could comfortably say, well, you can't really cull, you can't really reduce numbers. What is the impact in the long term of that type of decision? We can say we can't legalize the trade in ivory. What is the long-term impact of those kind of decisions? It has been proven before that because it tends to become a high-moving commodity, it's subject to abuse. And so how do you mitigate it from being abused? How do you mitigate the numbers by possibly shifting them to other national parks? Do those national parks have the level of resources required to sustain those populations of elephant species? So I think it's a fine line, and there's a balancing act that requires us to be sensible. And when I say sensible, we need to understand what is reasonable, feasible, and sustainable. Because I think the whole conversation around climate change is literally starting to look at the sustainability of our atmosphere and of what we're taking from the earth and how we're shifting that replenishment, or how we stop taking as much and start to find less abusive resources and less abusive methods. You know, so again, for me, the big word is sustainability, and this is not only environmental. This is kind of economic. It's economic, it's environmental, it's personal. I mean, the fact that farmers are now also under physical threat because of the size of elephant populations says to me that a different decision needs to have been made, and that decision needs to be what serves the greater good for the greatest amount of time.
Yeah, I feel like there's definitely a harmonious solution to this. I don't know what it is, but I know there is one. And also, it's funny that you brought up relocation, because Sage and I were talking about it, and that's what I was thinking. Like, why can't we just boat a bunch of the elephants or plane them to somewhere else? You know? Yeah, I don't know. So that maybe that could be an option. I'm not sure.
Maybe trying to regulate birth, like for, I don't know how that would work, but I've been thinking about dogs a lot, and how like we can't actually always let dogs like have their natural like birth cycle. Otherwise there will be too many dogs, and we'll need to like just like shelter them or like euthanize them, and so it feels weird to say that for like a wild species, but maybe there's something to do with like maybe the responsibility of a park is also to regulate the population in that sense, There's not just like euthanizing or like hunting, all those kinds of things. So I think there are a few like options to consider, and I would say, like as Gwenville said, there's probably a need like to sit down, have a discussion about this, have a study, maybe not go for like the choice that you would have made a few decades ago, but like carefully planning before you make that decision, so that the core and the intention feels different and actually helps both parties, the farmers and the elephants,
Yeah, and I think it's again, it does boil down to environmental sustainability in that sense, because again, national parks, while there might be kilometers and acres and of land and things like that, they also can only support so much wildlife. You can't also sustainably continue to expand those borders, because those animals are in their very natural habitat. So yes, relocation is an option, but we also need to understand what that does to the species if they are relocated, all those kind of things. But I feel like there's a bigger requirement to understand what is actually happening at an environmental level that probably impacts what these national parks are able to do, and also how sustainable they are in and of themselves. Because generally, as Sage shared, they're very much an ecotourism, and it serves an ecotourism industry more than anything else. But at the same time, we have seen in the past years that certain national parks have also faced droughts and those kind of things. So there has to be a balance struck with how big a population of wildlife can be allowed to become versus how sustainable it is to have that level of expansion of wildlife in those environments. So again, some probably uncomfortable, probably even tougher decisions are required. But again, it serves, if it serves a greater purpose, I think there's definitely space for it. And I don't believe that we should avoid those kind of conversations because they feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, who knows, we'll see how it unfolds, but maybe some of the, many of the people in like Southern Africa who are subsistence farmers, like they don't want to be involved in the ecotourism industry or something, because that solution would presuppose that because farming isn't as viable for them, due to such a big elephant population, which is crazy to think, that they would instead get their living from ecotourism. And so, yeah, I don't even know if many people would want that. Maybe they would, but that's a good question too, you know. But yeah, but you know, it's definitely, it says something about conservation and also on just the like the abundance of nature, its ability to really bounce back, because like those elephants have a huge population. They gestate for 2 years, I think, almost. The elephants have the, you know, the baby inside for like 2 years. So it's not a population that can like explode, you know, quickly, but they've really, you know, recouped numbers there at least. So yeah, it's partly a success. It's a success with some unforeseen consequences. Yeah. Big consequences. So yeah, that's all that I felt about it though. Do you guys have any
I
thoughts
think
about it?
it's,
Yeah.
I think we're good to move on. If you guys like are ready for it, to the next topic, which is pretty big as well. It's about Iran, and it's about the decision from the government to establish death sentences for anyone that went into the streets and protested. And also, like, there's been reports of activists and artists that have disappeared and that have been and their family being blackmailed against their freedom, I guess, from prison and torture, which never happened. We still don't know where they are. So, yeah, I think the Iran's government is like, has made a choice, and it's kind of surprising that they went even deeper with something that felt so unpleasant for their people, and how abusive and violent it is, and how there are methods even before the death sentences of like prison and torture have like caused the lives of like many people. So yeah, I'm just I'm kind of blown away by their choices there, and feel like there are a few things to unpack and maybe heal there. Yeah, sadly, Anja is not there to maybe help us, but like I think like we can still like feel into it and feel what is really at the core of what's going on there and what's the healing that is taking place.
So my feeling is that there's significant desire for control in this space. And it's likely that it's much more concentrated on what would be called the Islamic State more than anything else. But it's also, you know, I think it's like that there's the one side of the coin that's the significant desire for control, but then on the other side, there's also what has been probably a collective sense of giving away power. from an individual point of view. And so it would make sense that these two sides of this coin are starting to surface in such a, it's almost a violent way. And again, it comes back to some of our previous conversations, even in the Black Lives Matter series, where we have to understand if violence serves a purpose under these circumstances and what value it brings. And I think something that came up for us countless times was that the violence makes people pay attention. And so this almost martyrdom of rioters at the moment is drawing attention to what for me feels like a high level of control that Islamic people are starting to say no to. They are starting to want their rights respected a little bit more, which means, and I mean, it's following the trend of various movements for liberation across our history, across the ages, that the minute there's a desire for significant shift, there's also a requirement for significant raising of, well, for a significant contingent of people to stand up and say no to that level of control or tyranny or any other word that we would think is appropriate in this space. So I think it at the core of it, it feels a bit like a battle of wills, because the people that have the power, where they may have taken it directly or inadvertently, have power and are trying to hold on to it, and the people that are wanting to take their power back are needing to be a lot more aggressive about it, which is showing up in these riots and those kind of things. But I think the consequence of it is that there's a significant struggle playing out from the desire for change. And again, it's the desire for personal freedom that has probably not been enshrined as much in the Islamic State as in most other in most democracies.
Yeah, yes, like definitely. Like it's yeah, I think you know, I agree with you, because the thing is that you do have to speak the language that someone will understand. And if you're like setting a boundary or trying to triumph over someone who just is absolutely just has no qualms about using really violent or horrible means, you know, you have to use whatever means are truly like necessary, really, to make your point, because like you have to be able to, you know, stand up for yourself, and you have to be able to, you know, set a boundary on on tyranny, basically, on ego. And like one thing that I was reading about today, because I was just, you know, looking for any analysis on this, and everything was that in the last like decade, or especially half decade, there have been certainly like a lot of protests, a lot of nonviolent protests, but they haven't been as effective as getting any at getting any sort of changes. And that, you know, basically it's basically about like been neck and neck between like an armed protest or like a nonviolent one at getting change to happen, basically. And so I felt that was interesting. And one thing the article pointed out too is that like any protests that are really like about women and led by women and comprised of women, they tend to be more effective, because if women are protesting, the article said that the research said that they are taken more seriously. Like their cause is seen as like, oh, if you know, if even women are willing to like get out and appear in large numbers and, you know, protest and expose themselves to a repressive states, like repressive states like police forces or whatever, then like, oh, you know, this is serious and this is like a worthy cause, and that like violence is less likely to, you know, by like the authoritarian state if it's mainly a protest comprised of women. And so I was composed of women, and so I was like, oh, interesting, like how does this like apply in Iran, because it is a very much like it's centering on women and like the issue of women's right to just have like bodily autonomy, you know, to like be able to dress how they want to dress, or to not have their clothing policed, you know. So yeah, I read that and I was like, yeah, maybe, you know, this protest is more widespread and more successful and across regions of Iran, like so far because of that. But I don't know. I just want to float that out there because I felt it was, you know, kind of a good point or some interesting thing to consider. Yeah.
I think that's interesting. An interesting observation, although I don't know how true it is, in saying that the Iran's government have no qualms is like in like physically abusing these women and going to like maybe killing or like attacking, raping, and things like that. But I do think there's an element of truth in that observation, in the sense that if women are getting into the streets for it, and they're basically, sadly, in our world, they are more likely to be vulnerable and attacked. So if they're taking that risk and give it that kind of response, I think that's probably why it's taken more seriously. And I do also agree with like both Grendel and you on the fact that, you know, violence may have a purpose because, well, in the sense that defense in and of itself is a boundary and a response to attack, you know. But it's, I think like it's also only as God calls, and it's like kind of like it's I guess it changes from situation to situation. And I'm wondering like how will be the response to the government's new laws right now. How would that impact Iran and the rest of the world? And lastly, I would say then that this protests have had, I guess, more efficiency because their, you know, the visibility has been more widespread, right? You know, and it's still ongoing. Like the whole world knows about it, you know. And I think because of it, it might have triggered a response from ego. because like we kind of know that when it's dying or when it's in a position of like, I guess, weakness, ego is making a lot of noise because it's natural response. And I think it just shows that Iran's government is just choosing insanity and that there may not be going back from it, but that we'll keep like raising our voice for it because I think the world and Iran, like basically they're doubling down on like making noise to have this change in Iran. And I hope it like it does something for them. And then the government's choices of insanity are completely revealed. I think this just served to reveal them completely. And so we can be at peace with like the decision that it needs to change, like it definitely needs to change, you know. So that could be also an element and something to reflect on a spiritual level, I guess.
Yeah, and it's also quite interesting that there has been a response around the world in the form of some level of sanctions against some of these decisions that have been made, because technically the core of the message is that freedom of expression and freedom to stand up for yourself are being abused at the moment. And so there's a very strong answer from the world in the sense that sanctions are now being imposed in certain places for the reason that human rights are being abused. And I think it's very telling of the time and the age that we live in, that there's such a much more decisive response to these kind of human rights abuses. Also, I think just from the perspective of these protests being led more by women and children than by men, I think it just again highlights the level of violence from the state in response to these protests. So I think it's just really serving to bring more attention to it, given that there's been for years much more talk around and much more shift in society around protecting the rights of women and children in society. And so these sanctions just start to highlight that those rights and those strides are being supported in a much more decisive manner than they have been in the past.
Yes, and also I think the Iranian state, just before we go, is being kind of a little bit cautious, though, because they don't want to inflame greater resistance from the people. You know, I think that there's some fear of that, and there's acknowledgement that the people do have power there, because the only protester that they've sentenced to an execution, which obviously is never appropriate, I would say, was someone who like set a government building on fire. And so, you know, that's somebody who like did an action that was more violent than just like being out on the street and protesting, right? And you know, everything. So, and chanting death to the dictator, you know, that kind of thing. So really, I think that they're pretty in some ways, like they're kind of cautious because I think that they see like this could be like a true threat to their like tenuous, well, I'd like to say tenuous grip on power, on control. Yeah. So.
Cool. Thank you for that. And I think with that, we have our hour. So thank you to everybody for the conversation today. Thank you to everybody that's followed us. Please feel free to like and subscribe to our Church of Union YouTube channel, where you'll find all our previous conversations. And we look forward to seeing all of you next week. Thank you, everybody.